What is up, my brethren and wenches? I'm here to give you guys another undergrad analysis, but before I even get started, I'd like to say that of the 10 or so people who watched my last video, it was good to see at least 9 of you commented on it and gave me some decent feedback, so it's nice to know that although my videos aren't exactly going viral, which I'm 100% fine with, they're certainly reaching the right audience, and I got a lot of interesting opinions on Game of Thrones versus Song of Ice and Fire, and a few interesting favourite character translations as well that I personally wouldn't necessarily have thought of. So, for everyone who wrote in, thank you. So, today's topic is a big one. I mean, a really big one. I personally think that Theon Greyjoy is perhaps one of the more, and it's impossible to say this without sounding like a complete twat, but I think he is one of the more multi-layered characters that George has created that more and more is revealed about as time goes on. Now, while I most likely accurately assume that most people listening to this have read all the books in great detail, and that by and large you as an audience probably know more than I do about Westeros and about Theon Greyjoy, I think it's still worth going into a recap on where he was before Game of Thrones before going into a full-fledged character analysis on him. So, how Theon came to be at Winterfell as a ward or honoured guest, but really hostage of the Starks, was that 9 years before the event of Game of Thrones, his father, Balon Greyjoy, he started a bit of a rebellion against Robert Baratheon. Now, to cut a long story short, the rebellion didn't go so well. Both of Theon's brothers were killed in it, and the Ironborn were pretty soundly defeated. And Theon was taken in by Eddard Stark at the age of 9 as a hostage to ensure that Theon's father Balon stays on his best behaviour, lest Eddard cut off Theon's head. And so that's where Theon has spent most of his teen years. He's been at this place that, he didn't grow up at. He doesn't necessarily have a father figure in Eddard, as it's described in the books. The long shadow of Eddard's sword was always between them. And he was also much older than the other Stark children. It was only Robb who he really claimed to find any brotherly affection for. Jon saw him with a bit of mistrust. Bran, from his point of view, didn't warm up to him. Catelyn, a lovely woman to her children, but to kids who aren't hers, not the best lady. She didn't trust Theon either, so this leads to a lot of really interesting character dilemmas with Theon, and it's where he is driven towards what goes on in his arc from. And this is what I really like about the Ice and Fire books. While it's a medieval setting, it's got dragons, it's got swords, brethren, wenches, and everything. What it's really about is the human element. And I think Theon actually becomes quite a relatable character, but I'll go further into that in a second. Now, how I see Theon at the start of the books, and this is just in the books, I'll talk about Alfie Allen briefly in a moment, is he's described as very comely, and he's actually quite a stud with the women, which again is another point worth touching on later. There is so much to this guy. This is quite a prolonged introduction actually, but he's a comely young man, and he's actually very talented at a lot of things. He's described many times as being a very good marksman, a good archer, a good horse rider, most likely a better fighter than Robb or Jon. And so he truly is his father's son in many ways, or at least in those ways. So the impression I get of him is he's this quite arrogant, cocky, confident young man. And, I'm sure we've all known people like this as well. He's got everything materially satisfied, but when you delve a bit further into his psychology, he actually remains quite unfulfilled, due to feeling like he'd been given away by his father and, taken hostage and was a prisoner before the start of Game of Thrones. So that's where his complexity lies, even in spite of all of his material talents. So I guess before I launch into the point after this quite prolonged introduction, I suppose any of you who have made it this long might be wondering what I think of Alfie Allen. And I think he's a good Theon. He's not exactly how I saw the character. After reading the books, his hair color's wrong. To be honest, he's a good looking enough guy. He's a little bit creepy in Game of Thrones, really. Like, I don't really buy him as the stud that Theon was, but, at any rate, I felt all the right emotions when Alfie was performing. I certainly did feel sorry for him when he was in Winterfell talking to Maester Luwin, and yeah, I think he also looks eerily like Mick Jagger. So, that's my opinion on Alfie. And I might go into detail on this later on, I might not. It's not really planned, but his appearance in Season 3 and Ramsay's appearance in Season 3 is so far just serving to make me quite angry and frustrated with Game of Thrones. I mean, not only did we not originally see most of that stuff that was going on, but it's also quite gratuitous in many ways, and I don't really feel like anyone really needs to see, well, what is some guy just getting tortured all season. So now let's fast forward to Theon in Game of Thrones and throughout that story. Now, as I've mentioned, he was treated generally by the Starks with a bit of a mistrust. You know, he was just seen as this arrogant kid from another place, you know, a treacherous place as well. I'm a massive fan of the Iron Men, by the way, but yeah, he's from this treacherous place. They had him at the age of 9, and he's just seen with this general mistrust when he's there. And I think a key event from Game of Thrones, you know, that we do see that isn't, you know, during his teen years, that I see as quite important to the character, is when Robb confronts those wildlings, and one of them is holding, you know, Bran, saying, "Kill those wolves, then drop your weapons." And the show did this very well as well. And Theon, quite bravely in my opinion, you know, and he's an expert marksman as I mentioned, fells the wildling. And instead of Robb being grateful, Robb is furious. You know, Bran described that he had never seen Robb so angry before. And this is also mine. Robb was the one that Theon probably connected with the most out of the Starks, and he's just screaming at him over something that, you know, he thought was for the best. So I think I see that as a key moment, because it's sort of like, well, shit, even Robb, you know, the one I see as a younger brother, doesn't particularly appreciate me, doesn't really want me here, you know. Fuck. And I think this is what drove him towards what happened in A Clash of Kings, or at least it's one of the things that drove him towards lashing out at his former captors in that way. So then in A Clash of Kings, Theon returns home to Pike, and I would like to take a brief moment to just talk about what I think is a very underrated book in A Feast for Crows. I think that, for its money, in A Feast for Crows, even though it's the only book where Theon is barely even mentioned, he's just presumed dead in it, it's where we actually learn who the Ironborn actually are. And to Theon's credit, he left there at 9. How could he have expected his father to react the way he did to him, you know? Did you pay the iron price for this? Why are you wearing silks? The Starks have made you soft, etc. It is easy to see why he would have forgotten, or maybe he never properly knew just who his family was. I mean, he might have had memories of Victarion and Euron, and I mean, his uncles, all of them are batshit fucking crazy. But yeah, it's easy to see why he wouldn't have known, you know, how to come back and what attitude to take. He even seemed to forget that Balon probably still harbored a great grudge against the Starks for that rebellion. So it's conflicting point of views. It's ever ambiguous. I can see how Theon was treated when he returned to Pike from both Balon's point of view, batshit crazy as though he is, and from Theon's point of view, that he's essentially being spoken down to for something that he doesn't even feel is his fault. Now, another thing worth mentioning is his sister Asha, and how she just misled him and let him just hit on her shamelessly, which, admittedly, I'm gonna say this a bit ghetto, pussy is one of Theon's weaknesses, and, you know, shame and all, but that is still quite a betrayal from a family member there, when, again, as I said, he didn't really find a family in the Starks, so he's gone back, and lo and behold, the Ironborn don't particularly respect him or want much to do with him either. And thus begins his identity crisis, and here, at 10 minutes into my recording, I'm going to start to make the grand point of this first part of my little Theon retrospective, and that's that Theon's identity crisis, Theon not knowing who he is and not having a strong sense of self, began a long time before he was Ramsay Bolton's captive. It began a long time before he was Reek, and I think that heinous act of taking Winterfell, which I'll talk more about in part 2, and the way he killed those farmers' boys and how unforgivable it all seemed at the time, was just him essentially snapping, losing all connection with anyone or anything, and forgetting who he is, who he ever was. You know, at some point he might have seen himself as a bit of a prince of Pike, as one of the main Iron Men. At another point he might have seen himself as Theon the hostage, or Theon, Robb Stark's brother. By this point, at the end of A Clash of Kings, that's all gone. And I think this is why in A Dance with Dragons, in his Reek chapter and in a few of his chapters, it's not him saying, I am Reek, just because Ramsay's there and just because he doesn't want to get flayed anymore. It's him, honest to God, forgetting his name and forgetting who he ever was, forgetting he was Theon Greyjoy. You know, he's thinking in his mind, that was another man. I am now Reek, not even a man really. And I think it's an important distinction to make between Theon thinking he is Reek and honestly seeing himself as Reek, or even forgetting his name as Reek in that first chapter. You know, I have a name, what was it? I must forget or I'll get flayed again. The difference between that in his head and just essentially putting on a show for this sadistic prick who's got him as his captive, I think that's all a very deliberate part of Theon's character that started in the first two books, or even arguably a long time before the events of Game of Thrones started. So this is where Theon is now. He is Reek, he is Ramsay Bolton's pet, and by now I mean at the start of A Dance with Dragons, and I suppose arguably in Game of Thrones, although I did before express dissatisfaction with A Game of Thrones and how they're handling Theon. He's forgotten who he is. His castration, which by the way in the books was only ever implied, and I'm actually very unhappy that the other day's episode showed it overtly. It's another part of him losing his identity, of who he formerly was. Theon the ladies' man. Theon identified very much as a guy that could sleep around. In fact, I strongly suspect he used sex as a way of getting some of that old power back. The way he hit on his sister, the way he tried to describe a sex act to Robert in one of Bran's chapters in A Game of Thrones, and was quickly cut off. Or the disrespect he showed towards the captain's daughter in the ship on the way to Pike. So after he has been metaphorically and literally castrated by Ramsay, he's lost that part of himself as well, in his mind and in his body. So there's a real connection between mind and body going on with Theon in A Dance with Dragons. How things that are going on in Theon's mind are reflected in his body by the treatment he has received from Ramsay Bolton. So I guess I'll begin to conclude the first part of this retrospective, or, analysis here, because the second part's going to be more about the events in A Dance with Dragons and where Theon is now. But for now, what I want to ask anyone who's listening to this, well, actually, I'm curious about a couple of things. And one, I guess I'll get this out of the way. What do you guys think of the Theon Ramsay thing in Season 3? I mean, do you think it's for the best? Do you think it's for the worst? That they're showing it? Whatever. I mean, I completely acknowledge that maybe cutting off Alfie Allen for a few years might not have been a good move for them, or even a viable move for them, because who knows what roles he could be offered. I don't really know how that business works. I do acknowledge that there's probably a good reason they're keeping him on. Nevertheless, from a narrative perspective, what do you think of that? And also, what are your impressions on what I've just said and Theon's identity crisis? Have I enlightened you? Did you agree with me to begin with? Or do you think, what on earth is this guy talking about? I mean, at any rate, I'd love to hear what everyone else thinks on this, particularly if you disagree with me. In fact, maybe you have your own theories, maybe I missed something, let me know. And please tune in for part 2. It should be out within a day of this one.